Thank you, Ebony, and thank you for your kind and generous invitation to join such an esteemed group of past lecturers. I made the mistake as I was preparing of going back and watching some of the videos and listening to the past. I shouldn't have done that. But I am deeply honored to be among such amazing colleagues as Z. Nicolaza, Uyan Poon, Michelle Espino, and many, many others. And so I appreciate your invitation and the opportunity to join you all today. I want to begin by acknowledging the lands upon which we are today. I want to recognize that we gather on the lands originally placed in the care of the Peoria, the Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw peoples. I acknowledge that I am a visitor to this territory, and I carry a deep regard for the enduring presence of the relationships of the original peoples of this land. I acknowledge our connection to place and honor the land as a relative. And we gather today at a land-grant institution that occupies Indigenous land, and we must not forget our responsibilities to meaningfully engage and reflect on settler colonial policies and histories of forced removal, dispossession of land, and erasure of Indigenous peoples of this place. And as such, we must commit to robustly interrogating the context of higher education as it relates to policies and practices that impact Indigenous peoples and actively work to unsettle systems of exclusion, colonialism, and inequity. So briefly about myself, again, my name is Heather Shotton. I am a citizen of the Wichita and affiliated tribes. I am also a descendant of the Kiowa and Cheyenne people. I am a mother of 2 daughters, Sloan and Sophie. I'm a partner to John. I am a daughter to Harold and Pam, a granddaughter to Rosanna, Francis, Herman, and Frida. I'm a niece. I am a sister, an auntie, and a scholar. And in my work as a scholar, I center all that I do and my attempts to engage with scholarship that helps to uplift our communities and try to work to center that in love and resistance. And so today I'll invite you to come on this journey with me to think about how we might reimagine these spaces. So as we begin our time together today, I think it's very important for me to center my own work in my relationships to and with other Indigenous scholars. So it's important for me to consider my own scholarly genealogy. And in an effort to disrupt settler colonial systems of erasure, it's important for me to cite Indigenous scholars that are central to my work. I am privileged to have been influenced by, learn alongside, and to be in community with a number of critical Indigenous scholars, many of whom I will reference today. I am grateful to Indigenous thinkers and scholars who laid an intellectual path, a path that has allowed so many of us to critically engage with systems of settler colonialism and education. Their work has guided me and provided much needed language and intellectual space to disrupt systems and reclaim knowledges. Scholars such as Kanaka scholar Hanani K. Trask, and Noelani Goodyear Ka'opua, Lumbee scholar Brian McKinley Jones Brayboy, and Aleut scholar Eve Tuck. I'm also privileged to write and think alongside a group of brilliant Indigenous women scholars, my own community of sister scholars. And today, I draw much on our work together. Our collective scholarship provides an intellectually and spiritually sustaining space. It is a space that allows us to honor our humanity in our work and our love for one another. And it allows us to continue to push my own thinking, our own thinking in critical directions. And so I honor my sister scholars, Amanda Ticini, Christine Nelson, Stephanie Waterman, Robin Menthorn, Natalie Youngbull, Coco Reyes, Shelley Lowe, Charlotte Davidson, and Kahuna Vi Wright. I'm also privileged to work and to learn with a number of students, and I have the honor of caring for relationships with these emerging scholars with whom I learn each and every day. This is a new generation of Indigenous scholars who are becoming and to whom I am responsible, and today I honor them. My scholarship reflects these relationships, the relationships that I have developed with these scholars, with their thinking, with their stories, and their teachings. Ultimately, I am because we are. So today, I invite you to explore with me the work that I am engaging with to unsettle our institutions and reimagine higher education as a potential site for love and resistance for Indigenous students. But first, it's important for me to frame our institutions as sites of settler colonialism and address the historical and political underpinnings of settler colonial aims of higher education. A number of scholars have addressed settler colonialism and helped us to shape our thinking and understanding of this concept. Scholars such as Hanani K. Trask, Patrick Wolfe, Eve Tuck, and Wayne Yang, just to name a few. But today, in my continued efforts to cite Indigenous scholars, I turn to Indigenous scholar Eve Tuck and Noelani Goodyear Ka'opua to frame settler colonialism in the context of education and as an ongoing project of the nation state. Tuck and colleagues frame settler colonialism as the persistent social and political formation in which newcomers, colonizers, settlers come to a place, claim it as their own, and do whatever it takes to disappear the Indigenous peoples that are there. Within settler colonialism, they explain it is the exploitation of land that yields supreme value. And in order for settlers to usurp the land and extract its values, Indigenous peoples must be destroyed. We must be removed, and we must be made into ghost. Native Hawaiian scholar Noelani Goodyear Ka'opua, drawing on the analysis of settler colonialism in Hawaii by leading Native Hawaiian political scholar Hanani K. Trask, describes settler colonialism's plural because she notes that there are multiple settler colonialisms, particularly in the U.S. context. Settler colonialisms as seeking to rid the land of collective Native presence and permanence in order to make way for and legitimize settler societies. She reminds us that settler colonialisms are historically rooted, they are land-centered projects, and they are never fully complete. These understandings of settler colonialism help us to accurately frame our institutions as founding in and serving as tools of just that. So when we discuss institutions of higher education and marginalized, oppressed, and dispossessed populations, we often describe these institutions as not being built for us. How many of you have heard those words uttered, maybe uttered them yourself? Go ahead, raise your hands, that's all right. Right? So these institutions weren't built for us, they weren't made for us. And as I have navigated the complex, racist, and colonial systems of higher education over the last 25 years, as a student, as a practitioner, and now as a faculty member, I've often found my own self uttering those same words. These institutions were not built for us. And whether it's discussing the ill-fitting structures of access shrouded in pipeline language that privileges particular populations and note a singular, read more valued, point of entry and a linear path through higher education, or curriculum that centers Western knowledge as the standard and as superior, where colonial knowledge is framed as theory and Indigenous knowledge as myth. We repeat it over and over. These institutions were not built for us. However, when we reframe this through a settler colonial lens, the notion of historically white institutions shifts from not being built for us to a deeper understanding of these institutions functioning in exactly the way they were intended to function. We understand that these institutions were not only built for us, but they were built by us. They were guided by settler colonial aims of erasure and dispossession. So many of our institutions were built by Black and brown bodies through conquest and slavery on occupied indigenous lands, funded by the promise of empire and for the purpose of erasing indigenous peoples. As Dr. Craig Wilder reminds us, the founding, financing, and development of higher education in the colonies were thoroughly intertwined with the slave trade and devastated indigenous nations in the Americas. The Academy was beneficiary and defender of these processes. One must only look to this country's founding college and the 1650 charter of Harvard University that includes as part of its mission the education of English and Indian youth of this country in knowledge and godliness. It's important to note here that the change in this Harvard charter in 1650 was an attempt to recover from financial struggles. The college received funding from the English Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England, which raised and granted funds for Indian education at Harvard. This was the case for many of our country's founding colleges, funded in the aims of changing and colonizing indigenous people. It's also important to note that this remains in Harvard's charter today, the mission to educate Indian youth. And we must question how many of our institutions have that in their mission and how they uphold that mission or do not. It's also important to note that during that time period, there was but one Indigenous graduate student, a student who graduated from Harvard, a member of the Wampanoag tribe, class of 1665, was the first person to graduate from Harvard College, and he died only a few months after graduation and returning home. So again, we return to Dr. Wilder's indictment of this country's first colleges as weapons of empire. And he describes colonial colleges as imperial instruments akin to armories and forts, a part of the colonial garrison with the specific responsibilities to train ministers and missionaries, to convert indigenous peoples, and to soften cultural resistance and extend European rule over foreign nations. So when we consider how institutions of higher education continue to be active participants in settler colonial aims of erasure, we must take stock of the multiple and nuanced ways that our institutions perpetuate such aims. We are not removed from this history. We are a part of this history, and we perpetuate these settler colonial aims. One of the ways that we see this is in the way that Jessica Bissett-Perea frames present absence. She defines this as the space that indigenous peoples, who represent a host of distinct peoples and cultures with unique political relationships to the United States, it's the space that we have come to occupy in the broader U.S. consciousness. In higher education, one way that our present absence is perpetuated is through the intentional erasure of indigenous presence in modern society. Indigenous peoples are relegated to the past, always existing elsewhere, in another time, and just outside of the consciousness of non-Indigenous people. In our institutions, we are found only as antiquities in university museums or old photographs stored in Western history collections. Lumbee scholar Brian Brayboy reminds us in his development of tribal critical race theory that colonization is endemic to society. And as such, he describes the resulting erasure of indigenous peoples from the American consciousness by stating that the everyday experiences of American Indians, the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas, have essentially been removed from the awareness of dominant members of U.S. society. These viable images have instead been replaced with fixed images from the past of what American Indians once were. We are here, but we are rarely considered an integral part of higher education story. And despite the fact that Indigenous students have been enrolled in this country's colleges and universities for over 350 years, we remain invisible. This erasure of our presence, this writing out, the intentional writing out of Indigenous people in the story of higher education, is but one way that our institutions consciously and unconsciously perpetuate settler colonial aims. So I often have my students participate in an exercise when they take my American Indian education policy course. And I have them take one afternoon and go around campus. And I ask them to take stock. They can take photos and document how they see themselves reflected and where they see themselves reflected in the institution. So they will go out, and I assume they actually take the time to reflect and don't take the as a day to, I don't know, go do something else. But inevitably they come back with the same thing every semester that I have them engage in this exercise. And I ask them to reflect on what they come up with. But what they come back with they look at their courses, and they look at their course syllabi. They look at the readings that they're assigned, the text that they're assigned, who they're reading outside of Native American and Indigenous studies. Are they reading Indigenous authors? Largely they're not. They come back with photographs across campus, black and white photos, that keep Indigenous people in this fixated as historical relics, that acknowledge our institution's history with the Kiowa 5, actually the Kiowa 6, but they erase the Indigenous woman that was a part of that group. They come back with photos of the Kiowa 5 and the Kiowa 6 and our institution's relationship to Indigenous peoples in Oklahoma. But they are hard-pressed to find representations of themselves in present day and their presence in the university. They come back with reflections about their absence in the institutional narrative, how our institution perpetuates a settler colonial narrative that celebrates the idea that when our university's president came to Norman, Oklahoma, he came to this barren land where nothing existed, and he declared, oh, what possibilities. Except we forget that my people, Wichita people, Caddo people, were in Oklahoma. We are of that place. It was not a barren land. It was not undeveloped. There were people that existed and had existed and continue to exist in this space. And this is what they come back with. The other way that we think about the present absence of Indigenous people in higher education is through data and visibility, that ever-present asterisk. So if you think about it, when we look at large data sets in higher education or in really anywhere, we often see when things are broken down by race that Black people are represented, Hispanic populations are represented, white, Asian populations. Often we ignore Native populations. And what we might see is Native Americans or American Indians, Alaska Natives with a small asterisk and a footnote that says essentially N wasn't large enough, the population or sample size wasn't large enough, and there are all kinds of statistical issues that go along with that. But what has happened is we see this statistical erasure of Indigenous peoples. I don't know if many of you have read the work that Dr. Waterman and Shelley Lowe and I did a few years ago called Beyond the Asterisk, Understanding Native Students in Higher Education. The thought and idea for that book was birthed right here at UIUC. It came out of a meeting with a number of Indigenous practitioners and scholars that were coming together to think about how we could front this issue of erasure and invisibility. And we kept coming back time and time again to the issue of the asterisk, the ever-present asterisk, and higher education's refusal to acknowledge our presence in data. And so it birthed the idea, one, for the title of the book, and a way to push back and say we are here. And not only are we here, our colleagues are working to do amazing things. Our students are working to reclaim spaces and return to their communities. It was an attempt to reclaim our narrative and to shift the thinking about Indigenous people. We see it in terms of data and visibility in our institutions, where our institutions refuse to honor the political status of Indigenous students as citizens of tribal nations. In institutional data and reporting, we often see that students are able to self-identify as Native American. But our institutions often stop there and fail to ask about citizenship. So they place Indigenous students in a racial category, ignoring what Brian Brayboy refers to as the liminal space that Indigenous people occupy as both racialized and political people. We are citizens of sovereign nations. And when our institutions refuse to collect data on citizenship for Indigenous students, when they refuse to provide that type of data and work with tribal nations to better support their citizens, then they are refusing to see us, and it is another example of our present absence in our institutions. So when we take all of these things into consideration, institutions of higher education are doing exactly what they were built to do. They are erasing Indigenous presence and permanence and legitimize settler societies. And as Dr. Goodyear Kaopua reminds us, settler colonialism is never fully complete. It is an ongoing and an active project. So it's our responsibility to recognize the multiple ways that our institutions engage with this project, how they perpetuate these aims. And it is our responsibility to remain vigilant in our efforts to disrupt the settler colonial project. And in doing this, I invite us all to reimagine higher education as a site of love and resistance for Indigenous people. So over the past 4 years, I've had the privilege of engaging with work and research, and I've had the privilege and honor of being responsible to research with a group of Indigenous women scholars in an attempt to understand our experiences in academia and to document our journeys as Indigenous women scholars. We've done this through the use of photographs, creating a visual narrative of our experiences as Indigenous women in colonial spaces. While each of the women has their own unique story to tell, one thing has become very clear, and that is the focus of Indigenous women scholars on building community and sustaining community through their relationships with one another. Their focus on sustaining their relationships with their home communities and their focus on future generations. So I highlight here a few examples of how the women who I've endeavored in this work with represent this. So these photographs here represent a few things. This photo from Lucy is of her holding hands with her mentor, another Indigenous woman who really shaped and has supported her. And she describes this photograph as her holding the hand of her mentor, who also was on her doctoral committee, but has also become a dear friend and relative. And her presence and her thankfulness and her responsibility to this relationship is reflected in this photo. And you can feel in looking at it, without seeing their faces, without even words, you can feel that love that comes from that relationship. And what Lucy talks about when she talks about this relationship, she says that this is the person that actually kept encouraging her to pursue her PhD and to not give up when she didn't want to go on. And this bottom photo here comes from Sarah, and it represents two Indigenous women that are standing together. This is a time, these women actually held their dissertation defenses on the same day, together in the same space, disrupting institutional norms of how we hold dissertation defenses. They actually did a number of things. But this photo of them standing side by side in their moccasins, standing together in their power as Indigenous women, holding one another up and disrupting the norms that are imposed on us, what the expectations are of how we conduct ourselves in these academic spaces, is really important. But more importantly, what we see is them standing side by side, holding one another up, and we see a relationship that is rooted and centered in love. And then the final photo is Winona's photo, and she's holding it's a little rock with the, if you can't see it, with the words "inspire" inscribed on it. And she talked about this was a gift from one of her sister scholars, and just a kind gesture. But she talks about the importance of this and how that really helped to sustain her in a very isolating space in the academy. So she says that for her, when she holds this rock, when she holds this heart, it serves as a reference to know that she has sisters out there who really inspire her to be her best version of herself as an Indigenous woman scholar, as an Indigenous woman, as a mom, as a professional. And she says that these women inspire me. And so when she holds that rock, that heart in her hand, she's reminded that these women maybe not be there physically, but they are there, and their collective energy sustain her. All of these photos represent the centrality of love in our work and our endeavors in higher education as Indigenous scholars. What came up over and over again beyond love was our efforts in the academy as an act of resistance, as our presence in the academy as an act of resistance. And so I pulled a few photos here that reflect that and help us to think about what that resistance looks like. So this first photo is one of the women. It's actually her daughter, and she talked about this as planting the seed. And this is her effort to center Hawaiian learning and Hawaiian knowledge in her institution. And she says that this is the point of why she's in the academy and why she does what she does. And her goal is to help make a space for people to reconnect with ancestral practices and knowledge systems. And with respect to the next generation, including her own daughter and children of all of her friends and her family members, the goal of the university for her is to help create a space for them and to create a place of Hawaiian knowledge and learning in her institution. This bottom photo here of Navajo rugs depicts the framing of how we think about knowledge. What constitutes knowledge? What constitutes theory? What constitutes research? Dr. Amanda Ticini talks about weaving as research. Is a rug research? She poses these questions to us. And so in this photo, we see this reclamation of ancestral knowledge and the situating and centering and privileging of ancestral teachings as theory and research, and a refusal of the academy's attempts to discredit that knowledge. This third photo over here is the cover of a book from one of the participants, where, and if you can't see the title of it is Indigenous Leadership in Higher Education. And in this attempt to reclaim space, particularly intellectual space, this woman has chosen to think about intergenerational knowledge, to reframe how we think about leadership in higher education, not as something situated in hierarchy, but as based in a collective that is intergenerational, that honors elders and youth and Indigenous values, customs, teachings, and knowledges. And this final photo is actually mine. It was taken the morning after a Native American church ceremony that we had for my oldest daughter on her 18th birthday. And this was a ceremony that we endeavored in to lay a firm foundation for her as she was transitioning into adulthood and as we were preparing to send her off for her first year of college. And in this photo, what I see is the result of prayers that were said for her long before she came into the world. What I see are prayers that were uttered in love by our grandparents and our great-grandparents in the very same ceremonies that were held many years before us, before we were even born. Prayers of love that set intentions for generations yet to come. This photo also reflects the continued acts of resistance of our ancestors to hold on to our ceremonial ways and to utilize the same weapons of colonial systems in the protection of those ways. My daughter is a citizen of the Oto-Missouri tribe. Her father is the leader of the Oto-Missouri tribe, and they come from a long line of resistors. The Oto-Missouri tribe were one of the first tribes to incorporate Native American church as a church. And this was done in a time when there were a number of attacks on Native American religion and ceremony, where our ceremonies were outlawed as practice and policy and rule. And the Oto-Missouri people, as an act of resistance, sought to incorporate Native American church in an attempt to protect the ceremony under the constitutional protections of religious freedom. It was the first attempt to do this, and it was an ingenious act of resistance that led other tribes and the formal foundation and formation of Native American church. And so I see these all as various acts of resistance of our students, of our scholars, of our scholarship, of our ceremonies, and the way that they are present and continue to serve as acts of resistance in higher education. So as the women that I work alongside, as we've talked through these different photographs and what they mean, and as we think together to seek a mutual understanding of what our work and scholarship really is and what we seek to do through that work, we come back time and time again to love and resistance. Recognizing that our research, our scholarship, and the relational ways in which we engage with it is rooted in love. This is often framed as community, reciprocity, relationships, and nation building. But ultimately, what we see here, what these women are sharing through these photos, is love. The work that they do, the research with which they engage, the relationships that they nurture, and their willingness to engage in the struggle are all rooted in love. Our research as Indigenous scholars, our presence in the colonial spaces of academe is a constant act of love and resistance. Recently, with 4 of my sister scholars, Dr. Amanda Taccini, Dr. Chris Nelson, Dr. Robin Minthorn, and Dr. Stephanie Waterman, we authored a piece entitled Living Our Research Through Indigenous Scholar Sisterhood Practices. And in this piece, we discuss sisterhood practices that guide the ways that we engage with our research and our scholarship. And 2 of those practices that I want to focus on today are love and resistance. I read here an excerpt from our collective thinking about the sisterhood practice of love. When we gathered to discuss the significance of Indigenous sisterhood as it relates to our research, love percolated as a foundational practice. Love is central to the bond and the existence of our sister-scholar relationships. The actions that guide our relationships as sister scholars are based on a foundation of love and how we work together, how we find ways to support one another, and how we exist as Indigenous women in the academy. Love is taking time to help each other as we navigate our journeys through the academy. It involves finding ways to honor those who have laid a path for us. Love means providing guidance and support when we are searching for ways to balance our various roles, our families, and our communities. And more than anything, embracing love in our sisterhood practices requires an active nurturing of our bond as sisters and our responsibilities to care for one another. As I continue to reflect on our experiences in the academy and our choice as Indigenous scholars to engage in the struggles and harmful effects of these institutions, I am reminded of the amazing Indigenous students across the country, those who willingly enter institutions that continue to enact settler colonial practices, students who choose to sacrifice and engage in the labor of resistance, reclamation, and resurgence, the labor of nation building. We know the institutions of higher education were founded on settler colonial aims of erasure. We understand the history and continued engagement of our institutions in the dispossession of land of Indigenous peoples. We see it right now, each and every day. Our institutions are actively engaging in dispossession of land of Indigenous peoples. And we bear witness every day to the deleterious impacts of our encounters with the systems of oppression perpetuated by these institutions. Yet we continue to choose to enter these spaces and willingly engage in these struggles. And so I've often asked myself, why? Why? Why do we choose to struggle? And as I consider the willingness of Indigenous students and scholars to enter these historically harmful spaces, to enter institutions that were both not built for us and built by us, I return to this and I have to think about what is this choice to struggle? And I'm reminded of a conversation that I had with some of my students. And in this conversation, we talked about the decision of Indigenous students to go to college. We talked about motivations and desires of reciprocity and nation building, of struggle and sacrifice, rooted in love for the people. And in this conversation, one of the things that came up was likening this choice to enter institutions of higher education as our choice to enter ceremony. And when we enter ceremony, we humble ourselves, and we choose to sometimes physically sacrifice and suffer. But we do it for a love of the people. Did I tell y'all I have some really brilliant students? They shape my thinking in just amazing ways, and I really am blessed to get to be a part of their lives. And when my student talked about this, when my students started to talk about this choice to struggle and likening it to the choice to enter into ceremony, then I began to understand why we choose to enter these harmful spaces. We choose because we love our people. Their choice to willingly enter into these spaces, these colonial spaces, was framed as a sacrifice rooted in love. Their learning and scholarly endeavors are rooted in and seek to honor ancestral knowledge and enact nation building. But above all else, it's rooted in love for their people, for their ancestors, and for future generations. Likewise, there's an undeniable presence of love in the work that I have engaged with alongside other Indigenous women. And as I'm reminded that our presence in institutions, our choice to infiltrate these spaces, is an act of love. Our love is enacted in our efforts to reclaim intellectual space in the academy, to honor ancestral knowledge and teachings, and ultimately to contribute, even in a small way, to the collective well-being of our communities. Our presence in the academy is also a continued act of resistance, and I'm reminded that we aren't supposed to be here. We were supposed to be made into ghosts. So our presence is a continual act of resistance, and thus institutions of higher education have come to serve in multiple ways as sites of resistance for Indigenous people. I return to the framing of sisterhood practices and our engagement with the sisterhood practice of resistance. And I read an excerpt again. Engaging in Indigenous scholar sisterhood practices is an act of both resistance and protection for us. It's a way for us to resist the colonizing structures of the academy in a way that privileges our Indigenous knowledge systems and honors who we are as Indigenous women scholars and sisters. It also serves as a way for us to engage in cultural practices that ground our work and protect us from the collective damage we absorb by working in colonizing spaces. So I have to consider how we resist in these spaces. How do our students resist in these spaces? How do scholars resist in these spaces? We resist by refusing settler colonial narratives, by disrupting those spaces that erase our presence, that erase the responsibility that our institutions have to the land upon which they are built and to the people of those places. We resist by refusing our erasure in data, refusing our erasure in scholarship, refusing our erasure in privileging of knowledge systems. And we resist by rejecting and refusing colonial norms that stifle and strangle our creativity and refuse to see us as whole beings, that refuse to understand and honor our relationships to and for one another. We resist by reclaiming intellectual space and centering Indigenous knowledges as valued knowledge. not as something that is other, but as something that is central and that we all can learn from. And we resist by gathering the intellectual tools of these spaces and utilizing them as weapons to build our own communities, to build our tribal nations. So I ask, what are our institutions' responsibilities? And what are our responsibilities to unsettling our institutions? We must engage in critical self and institutional reflections about the conscious and unconscious ways that higher education continues to perpetuate in, or to participate in and benefit from the erasure of Indigenous people. How do our institutions benefit from this erasure? How do you as an individual benefit and perpetuate Indigenous erasure? How does your scholarship benefit from the erasure of Indigenous people? And more importantly, how will you seek to disrupt that? We must engage in decolonial practices that honor Indigenous commitments to sovereignty and self-determination. We must first and foremost acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of this land, and we must acknowledge Indigenous peoples as nations, as sovereign nations, and the students in our institutions as citizens of those sovereign nations. And we must acknowledge that their presence here is an act of resistance, and it is our responsibility to engage in decolonial practices that help them to gather the weapons that they need to return to their communities and build their nations. As we honor our relationships and responsibility to the lands that our institutions occupy and the peoples of those lands, we have to think beyond land acknowledgments. We have to think about our relationships to lands. And more importantly, when we think about and center relationships and love, we ultimately have to center our responsibility. What is our responsibility to this place? What is our responsibility to be stewards of the land? And as institutions of higher education, what is our responsibility to not harm the land and to not harm the people of that land? So we have to move beyond empty statements that are read like a checkbox that acknowledge who was once here. We have to think about what that commitment is and disrupt that. Because while we can talk about the original inhabitants of a place and of land, and we can talk about settler colonial policies and violent policies of removal, that doesn't mean that the original people of this land are not still here. Their ancestors are here. Their knowledge is here. Their presence is here in this place. So we have to move beyond empty statements and checklist that we move through and tick off in a syllabus or at the beginning of a talk, and think about how we are actually going to engage in acknowledging land. How we are going to engage in practices that honor place and treat land as a relative. And we must also center and privilege Indigenous knowledge. As Lindsay Dupre so eloquently reminds us, Indigenous knowledge systems have lived through these lands since time immemorial and will continue to be here long after the current buzz and definitions of reconciliation die out. Whether or not institutions make space for this knowledge does not change this, but it can present possibilities for advancing justice and belonging for Indigenous peoples while we are operating within these systems. So what is our responsibility to center and privilege Indigenous knowledge? And as we reimagine futures for Indigenous students and Indigenous peoples in higher education, we must consider the centrality of love as an act of resistance in higher education. Choosing love and centering love in our relationships and our work and our presence in these spaces is an act of resistance. It is a disruption of settler colonial aims of erasure. It is a disruption of privileging and framing of colonial knowledge and norms. Our presence as Indigenous people in these spaces is rooted in our continued resistance to our erasure and the hope that we might secure a better future for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and the many generations that will follow. We seek to smooth down paths for future scholars, for future students, for those who will come behind us, ensuring that our work in the academy continues to strengthen our communities and build our tribal nations. So I invite you to join us in our efforts to unsettle the institution and reimagine higher education as a site of love and resistance for Indigenous students. Aho.